What do a taxi driver in Mexico City, a street vendor in Guatemala, and a waitress in Lima have in common?
Most likely, they are all workers in what we call the informal economy.
Or at least, they were before COVID-19. I'm Carlo Pizzinelli.
And I'm Jorge Alvarez. And we've been researching how in Latin America, the workers with the fewest rights have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Let's imagine for a moment that you work for a construction company in Colombia. There is no formal contract with your employer and no protections like sick pay, pensions, and holiday pay.
This is the informal economy, a wide and diverse set of jobs, firms, and entrepreneurs that operate outside traditional regulation and taxation systems. And it is the standard arrangement for millions of workers in industries like tourism, transportation, and fast food, industries that have been among the hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic.
When the pandemic reached Latin America and lockdowns were implemented, scores of workers went into unemployment or dropped out of the labor force. In total, more than 30 million people lost their jobs within a few weeks, representing over 10% of the working-age population.
We wanted to find out more about the scale of inequalities in the impact of COVID-19 on labor markets. So we took a closer look at the microdata from 5 large Latin American economies, including Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Colombia, representative of a population of over 400 million.
This data traces the experiences of individual workers through the pandemic and allows us to examine whether certain demographic groups or types of workers were hit the hardest by the fall in employment.
The data also allows us to track how different government transfer programs helped, and it helps us identify opportunities to improve the targeting of these programs going forward.
As we conducted our research, it quickly became apparent that women, the young, and the less educated workers were some of the most affected. And while transfer programs implemented helped, the data shows they did not fully offset the impact of the pandemic on incomes.
This is partly because these groups are more likely to work in the informal economy, where support programs such as payroll subsidies or unemployment insurance schemes have a limited reach.
Our study also indicated another phenomenon. The speed at which workers lost their jobs was in part determined by their status as an informal or formal workers, with informal workers losing their jobs quicker.
When we focus on the data from Colombia, for example, one of the countries with high COVID-19 cases per capita, we see a sharp drop in employment, with about a quarter of jobs being temporarily lost, most of them in the informal sector, and with women being more affected.
But there is part 2 to this story, and that's that the informal sector was also the quickest to begin the recovery.
In Colombia, for instance, at least 6 out of 10 jobs that have been gained since the height of the lockdowns in the first half of 2020 have been gained in the informal sector. And with sluggish formal employment growth, particularly for women, the informal sector has played a crucial role in achieving at least a partial recovery.
And it wasn't just Colombia. In fact, this trend was occurring in the other countries we were monitoring, including the 5 large economies in Latin America. What surprised us the most was the magnitude of the employment losses, and then the sharpness of the recovery.
Informality was, in a sense, a double-edged sword. On the one hand, limited employment protections meant that informal workers were more likely to experience job losses and a reduction in working hours when the pandemic struck. On the other hand, limited regulation and bureaucracy also meant that it was easier for informal workers to go back to their jobs and take advantage of the opportunities presented by a post-pandemic world.
So, what does this mean for the future? No matter where the workers are located, in Latin America or elsewhere in the world, we see a remarkable resilience and adaptability. In particular, the flexibility of the informal sector may be helping economies adapt quickly.
In fact, when we look at data from commutes within cities to try to track the impact of COVID-19 lockdowns, we see evidence that more recent lockdowns might be less job destructive, as economies are learning how to adapt and cope with the pandemic.
So, what do the taxi driver, street vendor, and waitress have in common?
They're more likely to be already back at work. But it is not all good news, and while the informal sector is bouncing back quickly, there are significant delays in the formal sector, where rehiring after long disruptions might be trickier and costlier.
Research shows that formal jobs are essential for long-run growth and tax revenues to support government spending. if we fail to boost formal jobs, increases in informality may lead to poorer and less productive economies.
So tackling barriers to the creation of high-quality formal jobs remains more important than ever for a full and sustainable recovery.